So this is a little lecture on John Cage. It's about 35 minutes, and there's one brief sort of audio-visual gimmick in the middle, which I will announce when we get to it, and then we can have some questions afterwards if you have any. This is a writer's impression of some ideas about music. It's not scholarly. It's sort of written inside the music, and as a way of describing how it feels to admire certain kinds of music. So here it is. It's called John Cage and the Question of Genre. The first performance of 433, John Cage's silent piece, that I saw in the late 70s was a provocation. A provocation within the little conservative private school where I spent my high school years. Perhaps Will Schwalbe, the performer, who was at the time noteworthy for his theatrical skills, knew that the Sex Pistols were about that time releasing God Save the Queen in the United Kingdom and thereby thumbing their nose at the monarchy. And maybe he knew about Laurie Anderson's provocations of the moment, like Duets on Ice, or Vito Acconci's text and sound pieces from the early and mid-70s. Maybe Will was commenting with his performance of 433 on the stifling environment of the little private school, on the revolution of punk in England, but likely there were other layers of commentary too, on performance itself, for example. Perhaps he was simply encouraging us to listen, which would have been somewhat novel in that environment. In our chapel, the masters lined the walls all the way around the space, and we occupied the seats below them so that the masters could mark down who was late and who was absent, and then these absentees would be required to attend detention. And so there was, during 433, the marking down, the scribbling of pens and pencils, and the whispering of teenage ADHD cases, and the occasional cough. And then gradually there was consternation among the kids, among those more habitual listeners to Little Feat and Traffic and the Grateful Dead. The sound of this consternation, the increase in stirring and categorical anxiety, was the unmistakable music of that music. John Cage's chance operations are useful not simply because they eliminate ego or self-expression and the burdens thereof from the work, which is a breath of fresh air in the midst of bourgeois individualism. Cage's chance operations also describe the way the universe works, at least according to Cage. While his expressions of fealty to the Zen model are confined to a particular period, his adherence to the I Ching and to later computer programs that could generate random sequences are a demonstration of belief in a music of chance, regardless of ideology, and the way in which chance is at hand, in every way willing to demonstrate itself and its unperturbable ubiquity. Cage's interventions on behalf of chance indicate that this is how things are, that the legacy of individualism is temporary, is nothing in the face of the brute force of time and space, which are much more like what Cage managed to bring to the surface. Cage teased out some fundamental forces so omnipresent and so often invisible, and in a way the legacy of chance began to operate on Cage himself, on what he did professionally, and on how he was spoken of after the fact. What does all this have to do with sound art? Part of my brief for this talk was to talk about sound art and the centenary of John Cage. One possible way into addressing the concept of sound art would be to ask first, whether sound art exists. What would it mean for sound art to exist? The first use of the term, according to superficial accounts, dates to 1983 and to an exhibit by that name at the Sculpture Center in New York City, curated by William Hellerman. The tendency to see sound art then as the bastard child of visual arts activity, and in this case as a kind of sculpture, seems coincident with the dawn of the term, and thus generic bastardy has ever seemed part of the world of sound art. That is, sound art is art that engages the sonic register, assuming that it's possible to agree on what a sonic register is, and assuming that works of the sonic register are in fact primarily fashioned thereof. That this term appeared in 1983 is somewhat strange, when there were works of this sort as far back as the Dada period, in, for example, Eric Satie's Vexations, whose thorny and enharmonic score is meant to be performed for a duration of 840 repetitions, quote, in the deepest silence by serious immobilities, unquote. And let us not forget to mention Yves Klein's 1960 monotone symphony, The One Glorious Note, followed by some nudes silently covering themselves in blue paint. It must be the ferment of 1983, the eruptions of historical change in 1983, which made the term sound art likely, if not the craft itself, which was already practiced. The term retroactively spawned an approach, and the approach befitted the times, included the instabilities, the labilities of that time and its anti-tradition, so that what might have been considered music or what might have been considered visual art or performance could suddenly somehow be described as sound art, while nearly contemporaneously performance art could be considered performance art, thus creating subdivisions where none had been necessary before. Cage himself in 1983 was at an inflection point, a transition from the very procedural pieces of the 70s into the large-scale works, the Europera pieces, of later in the decade. He was also making time for occasional pieces from Merce Cunningham's dance company and elsewhere, like Instances of Silence, a piece for cassette players and cassettes. Does Instances of Silence, like 433, constitute an instance of music or an instance of sound art? And does the fact of sound art, the term, require a recontextualization of Instances of Silence? Does it make sense to think of Cage at all as a participant in sound art? Yes, a daily chapel service was part of the curriculum at my boarding school, and in the course of daily chapel, we heard a lot of music. I learned in this way about Bach and Telemann and Purcell, because the head of the music department, who is also an organist, played preludes and postludes every day. But occasionally there would be another musical performance. Thus, on this day, Will Schwalbe was on the bill, as indicated in our leaflets, to perform a certain piano piece by John Cage. A piano sat in the aisle of the chapel by the pulpit, situated for his use. Will came out from the ante-chapel at a certain point and sat down on the piano bench. The more well-informed among faculty and students perhaps knew what was to come, but I was not among the well-informed. I had heard incompletely about Cage without attaching any particular meaning to the reputation. Will sat at the keyboard for a while, and those of us who were ill-informed passed through several stations of unenlightenment. For example, the station in which we expected Will to commence to play, and Will did not commence to play. And we waited beyond what was a reasonably long period of time in which playing should have begun and did not. And at first we imagined there was a reasonable explanation for this absence of playing, and then we hypothesized as to the reason for the absence of playing. He was waiting for music to be brought out by his page turner. He was waiting for another player who had somehow failed to materialize, a flautist perhaps. He was having a profound emotional blockage, and it would only be a matter of time before concerned faculty helped him from the bench to health services. All these thoughts, and only 30 seconds had passed. Woody Guthrie's health, while he was housed in a Brooklyn hospital with late-stage neurological illness, was erratic, and he had both good days and bad days. And it is said that when the songwriter Bob Dylan visited him, Dylan found a sympathetic ear on some days, and on other days, Guthrie berated him. Guthrie's widow on occasion has decried the way in which Guthrie's voice late in his career, after the onset of symptoms, was so influential for the folk music revival. That is, Guthrie imitator Bob Dylan imitated the vocal instabilities of Guthrie's illness. And others, imitating Dylan, imitated Huntington's chorea, until it can be said in some ways that Huntington's chorea became the most imitated vocal style in the recent history of American song. Guthrie arrived at his illness stochastically through an arrangement of genes and chance and time, through the erratic progress of biochemistry. Guthrie's time in the hospital was considerable, about 12 years. Guthrie had watched his mother die of Huntington's in the same way, and two of his older children from his first marriage also died prematurely, probably of Huntington's. And so, Guthrie, as a presence, represented principles of narrative inconsistency. Guthrie, as a presence, as a legacy, seemed to exhibit the material silence that became so moving in Cage's work. As a songwriter, as a father, as a political voice, Woody Guthrie reverted to silence. Oddly enough, I recently found links in video clips on the themes of the Woody Guthrie centenary cataloged on an international psychoanalysis website. On a superficial basis, this would seem a strange place to find information about Woody Guthrie, but not in the centenary year of John Cage and Woody Guthrie. Links in this case were to be found on the page in question, as though the links are evidentiary on their own, indicating the way that the exemplary folk singer and his engaged socialism might be interpreted under a rubric of psychoanalysis. Guthrie, Oedipal rebel. Guthrie, author of children's music and the polymorphously perverse. Guthrie, the murder ballad and the repressed sociopath. Guthrie's career as perfectly constructed folk song with multiple endings. Guthrie's career as disputed text of folk song. All might be equally plausible for such a psychoanalysis, itself somehow stochastic. And on this list of hypothetical writings about Guthrie, you might also find the essay that conjoins the work of John Cage, exemplar of the stochastic, with the work of Woody Guthrie. In such an essay, it might be noted that not only did they live in the same city for many years, but Guthrie and Cage also eventually reached some concord on the matter of politics. For though Cage was for many years somewhat apolitical by the late 60s, or at a moment roughly coterminous with the last part of Guthrie's grueling death, John Cage adopted a much more politically confrontational point of view, somewhat informed by his friendship with Buckminster Fuller and others. He opposed the war in Vietnam. He was publicly anti-capitalist on numerous occasions, and thus his political stance grew ever closer to Guthrie's. Indeed, Cage in some ways went beyond Guthrie's socialist, communist beliefs to occupy a political position that included expressed support for Mao during a period in which the forced labor of the Cultural Revolution was not yet widely known. Quote, "Today, without hesitation, I would say that, for the moment, Maoism is our greatest reason for optimism. We must welcome its lessons with great attentiveness." Unquote. At some point in any performance of 433, whose performance is more the length of a piece of popular music or a folk song than it is the length of a concerto, and thus it is a very particular commentary upon the musical consumptions of the popular audience. At some point in any performance, the listener becomes aware, as with a kind of lightning strike, that a performance is taking place, that there's something in the nature of performance that is different from unmediated reality. And so it was with Will Schwalbe, who first performed 433 for me and my classmates, who is not a piano player at all, after all, and who was instead a talented actor in student productions, and who must therefore have been involved in a performance in that counter-narrative of reality that's occasioned by performance, however faint the alteration might have appeared on this day. It might be possible to map the stages of awareness during a performance of 433 onto the 5 stages of death as created by Kubler-Ross: denial, bargaining, anger, depression, acceptance. Realizing that Will was a performer and that a performance was taking place for me and the other members of the uninformed audience constituted a kind of bargaining. We accepted that we were now consuming a performance, but we were still hanging on, wondering if an agreed upon dynamic of performance would ever, that morning, erupt from silence. Lawrence Foster, the conductor of the BBC Philharmonic in the televised orchestral broadcast of 433, plays the conducting role to the hilt, including a moment between movements, there are 3, in which he theatrically wipes his brow. There's backstage footage of him, too, after the performance, between curtain calls, in which he banters with the production staff before going back out. The apparatus of 433, as always, only improves the piece, makes it more theatrical, and Cage, late in his career, when theatrical effects were closer to his heart, would perhaps have appreciated this theatricality, especially as he often had union problems with orchestras when trying to mount his work. Why is the BBC Philharmonic rendition of 433 so moving? Why do I feel tempted to weep? It's the same way I feel upon gazing at a late performance by David Tudor, 1990, longtime accomplice to John Cage, who recorded a performance near the end of his own life when he had long since given up the piano and instead had become a composer of electronic music. Tudor does not mug, does not self-aggrandize, does not oversimplify any comic potential in the work, instead satisfying himself with a fluid performance of the minimal gestures associated with the piece. While we do not know in this case what the performer was thinking while performing, we can hypothesize that there might have been memory associated with the performance, and that memory is an appropriate activity, a meditative occupation, during the less animated passages of the piece. Cage's 433 feels poignant in Tudor's 1990 performance, for what is projected upon it, the first performance in 1952, and it is nothing if not a canvas on which projecting can take place. The stochastic enterprise that was the creative work of John Cage needs to be considered at the level of the career itself, in the interpretation of the career, not just in the perception of a particular piece. That is, while we might talk about how stochastic operations work in indeterminacy or in his numbers compositions, we fail if we don't consider the stochastic possibilities of the Cage career as a whole, his approach to what he did. It's also important to pause over how an interpreter, the writer on the subject of Cage, might speak in and through the stochastic approach in trying to write about Cage and to celebrate the 100 years of his birth. So, it's not hard to imagine Cage in his later years moving freely among activities that were putatively musical, labors that were visual, labors that were literary, with the aid of his trusty I Ching, choosing to do the one or the other simply because chance dictated that he do so. And in this way, the genre in which the works would find themselves would most properly itself be called stochastic rather than musical or literary or otherwise, which in turn suggests that among the very numerous casualties of the legacy of John Cage is the designation of genre itself. As Foucault speaks of the field of sexual expression in the history of sexuality, so does Cage speak to the field of creativity, and in the field of creativity, no genre remains standing at the end of his assault. Music appears on occasion to consist of the absence of music. Literature appears to consist mainly of intertextuality. Visual art seems to consist of notes on a staff randomly applied, and performance seems to consist of playing chess in public or gathering mushrooms, or the performance consists simply of being John Cage. Cage resisted recording and often considered performance the essential record of his work. In fact, Cage was a theatrical performer, a performer for whom theater would be as adequate a generic designation as composer. And yet he performed his own recordings on occasion. He was therefore not above being a technologist. He also made use of other people's tape recordings in Fontana mix, and he was an early adherent and adept with synthesizers, oscillators, ring modulators, and other electrical and electronic instruments. He used radios on stage as early as the 40s. His scores were considered works of visual art and were sold as such. His writings, especially the appropriated pseudo-acrostics made from Finnegan's Wake and elsewhere, are absurdly refractory of literary intention. If composer is a highly inadequate term for the activity of Cage, what about sound artist? In some way, the modern vogue for sound art could easily be laid at the feet of John Cage. Sound art could appear to come from under Cage's skirts, as Hemingway said of Huckleberry Finn and its first person. Sound art could be said to come from Cage, but it would be like carving a snapshot from a panorama. This essay, in fact, is constructed according to a stochastic set of principles in the following way. This essay's contents were written in discrete sections, and the sections of this essay were then numbered and fed into an online randomizer, which means, as Cage says in his essay on indeterminacy, quote, "This is a lecture on composition, which is indeterminate with respect to its performance. An experimental action is one the outcome of which is not foreseen. Being unforeseen, this action is not concerned with its excuse." which means that the relationships between the parts of this essay are yours to construct, which means that you're a participant in the creation of this lecture, which means that it is not exactly an essay, but perhaps something a bit more performative. And thus, if a stochastic process, when applied to a piece of music, changes the process dynamically in just the way that observation alters the position of subatomic quanta, then isn't it the case that a fixed genre has no place in stochastic process? Isn't genre a limitation of the free play of creativity, which is precisely what stochastic processes unveil? And therefore, isn't the legacy of Cage with respect to what is or is not music, or sound art, or visual art, or literature, a legacy that precisely calls hierarchies into question, so that in the blast furnace of Cage's work, we see something more elemental, which is simply the human being busy about the task of creating. As a way into this essay, I have recently begun spending time in New York City fashioning audio recordings of celebrated works of visual art. That is, I have begun attempting to listen to visual art, to make it perform in a genre that's beyond its intended brief, simply to see if it's possible to pry these works loose from a rigid generic designation while still learning from them and being transported by them. It's surprising when many museums are preoccupied with the danger of abridged copyright, or when many museums are fixed on the possibility that flash photography might in some way alter visual art. It's surprising how easy it is to whip out an iPhone in order to record a painting. In no museum in New York City was I apprehended or detained from the activity of recording the sound produced by the old masters, although I certainly felt odd about the activity, as though I myself was running afoul of the keenly enforced law of genre. Here are some examples edited together. First, Monet's Water Lilies, recorded at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, also featured a painting by Mark Rothko from the same museum, a Jackson Pollock recorded 2 weeks ago at the Yale Gallery of Art, and likewise, some photographs by Robert Adams from the same venue. I'm going to play these pieces in succession. Note how the sonic register works in the visual arts. As in the case of 433, it invites the participation of the people nearby, invites them to construct the sonic work alongside the artist. Okay, so here we go. Now you get to hear something. This is exactly the length of one movement of 433. That is, it's about 1 minute 40 something. So your tremendous discomfort at the silence will perhaps be punctuated by my indicating which painting you are hearing. Monet. Mark Rothko. Robert Adams. Jackson Pollock. You did it. You got through a recording of some paintings. Congratulations. While 433 amounts to a composition of a kind with rigorous performative instructions and just enough flexibility to be a performer favorite, it's sometimes considered among those who are given to thinking of Cage as more theorist than composer, something of a gimmick. People who love Cage's music often point to the early piano pieces, like In a Landscape and A Dream from the 40s, with their mixture of Satie-like angularity and Japanese simplicity. Or people who love Cage point to his transformative percussion music, or they refer to the theoretically dense later works. But these listeners do not often search out 433 as an example of a piece they like. They perhaps admire it more than they like it. They don't look for recordings of 433. Nevertheless, thorough compositional premeditation is apparent in the piece, as well as a particular tonal palette and a score. It would be hard not to think of the piece as a brazen and electrifying musical composition when considered in this light, in exactly the way that Warhol's Brillo boxes from 1964 are also brazen and electrifying. How, through a process of composition, do you write a piece that is an abrogation of the compositional process, a composition with the fewest traces of composition about it, one that is music or is noise or some combination of the two, depending on your vantage point, though in all cases, somehow incredibly moving? Are we therefore to assume that all works of sound art are somehow necessarily exclusive of their visual register? A recent sound work that had a particular impact on the writer of these lines was Janet Cardiff's 40-part motet, a work in 40 channels in which she recorded a specific rehearsal of Thomas Tallis, separating each of the 40 voices into an individual channel so that the audience is in some way inside the rehearsal within the Tallis piece, so that the audience cannot hear the entirety of the piece without moving through the space, so that active audition, to use the Cagean term, is required in order to grasp the simple but strikingly elegant conceptual exercise at play in Cardiff's construction. I went to engage with this piece several times while it was installed at the Museum of Modern Art, and the experience was never the same, no matter how long I stayed, and it was never less than beautiful, sometimes perhaps even too beautiful, overwhelmingly beautiful, because of the active use of the space and speaker placement and so on. It was a museum piece at MoMA, not a piece of music in a concert hall. And so in that sense, it was not music, but an architectural response to music or a sculptural refraction of music. Does the Cardiff work have to be sound art? Why not architecture? Why not mixed media? Why not visual art when the placement of the speakers, for example, each on its individual stand, certainly has physical features not unlike the sculpture of the minimalist period? Would a video record of Cardiff's piece constitute a piece of sound art, or would it be considered a video? And would either of these things convey the meaning of the piece, if indeed there is a fixed meaning, and not a cloud of potential meanings? And are these the sorts of questions that are more logical when sound art is considered after the model of John Cage? In 433, we know that we're going to be challenged with respect to our conventional notions of musical performance. We know that 433 constitutes a ritual of performance, and we're eager to participate in that ritual, but we also feel internal pressure and creative tension. As the piece moves into and through its course, as we all get a chance to experience how long 4 minutes and 33 seconds really is, there's complexity and uncertainty. What if, for example, a rogue performer, outraged at the indolence of the whole thing, simply decides to break out and play a few measures of Bach? The ritual of Cage's piece becomes a ritual of agreement between performer and audience, one that seems almost impossible to maintain. In the aforementioned BBC video, the commentary amounts to high hilarity. Though the silence of the piece and the silence before and after the piece are similar, the audience is greatly relieved when the tension of 4:33 is over, and the response of the audience is a great swelling of applause. It's over. We did it. And the commentators, the exegetes, are grateful too, because nothing is harder for a commentator than to refrain from commenting. The idea that silence somehow engenders commentary, requires commentary in the BBC 4 broadcast is one of the great paradoxes of Cage. The guy actually says, "This is the piece that everyone's come tonight to hear. There really is nothing like 4:33. But there are also in this remarkable video the multiple camera setups, close-ups of the players, the little plastic alarm clock on the conductor's podium, the attempted but somehow inadequate motionlessness of the audience. It's not just a silent piece of music in the BBC performance. It's a ritual in which the audience participates just as wholly as does the orchestra, and the rapturous applause at the conclusion is clearly the audience applauding itself and also applauding taxonomical challenge. Derrida says in his essay on Maurice Blanchot, The Law of Genre, that genres are not to be mixed. And what he means is that there's specific legal apparatus that remains fixed to deal with all of those who insist on endangering the notion of category, on calling a thing by another name. The legacy of Aristotle depends on our application of these notions, and without the Aristotelian legacy, how are we to talk about art in the first place? How is a work of visual art a work of visual art, or a work of sound art a work of sound art without its name? During his lifetime, Cage, it's worth remembering, was vilified with great regularity. People streamed out of his performances well into the 6th and 7th decades of his life, and such august guardians of the American arts as the New York Times did not refrain from unloading on this or that Cage performance. In this way, Cage seems to bring down on his head the legal apparatus that Derrida refers to in The Law of Genre, uproar as the trace of genre-related violence, uproar as sign that genres were in fact mixed. At the end of the day, the genres feel as firmly established as the fundamental forces subsequent to the Big Bang. And yet Cage himself seemed somehow, through his determined, cheerful, and American demeanor, to have some access to the actual being Big Bang itself, to creative work prior to genre, to creative work whose primary intention is simply that it is creative, so that it might give a name to creativity itself. Thanks a lot.